All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that one of you suggested. And I have to say, it's pretty fascinating stuff. We're going to be diving into, you guessed it, Feng Shui.
Oh, yeah. This is a good one. You know, when most people hear feng shui, they probably think of, I don't know, like moving their couch to a different spot in the living room or something, just to get some good vibes going.
Right, right. Like it's all about interior design tips or something.
Yeah, but it goes so much deeper than that. I mean, feng shui, or you might hear it called Chinese geomancy sometimes, is this really old practice from, well, China, obviously. That's all about figuring out how to be in sync to harmonize yourself with the environment around you.
And it's using these kind of unseen energy forces.
Yeah, exactly. And the name itself, feng shui, it literally means wind water, which is kind of cool if you think about
It
it.
is. It really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does. It kind of shows how people way back when believed that the shape of the land and the way water flowed, it all kind of directed this universal chi, which you can think of as like a cosmic current.
Okay. Like a kind of energy.
Yeah, exactly. Like an energy flowing through all these spaces, through buildings and everything.
So it's not just about where you put your furniture then.
No,
Yeah.
no, not at all. Traditional feng shui, it takes into account so many different things. You've got astronomical stuff, astrological stuff, architecture, cosmology, geography, even like the actual shape of the land, the topography. It's a really big picture way of looking at how we're connected to the world around us.
Yeah, that's definitely a lot more than just picking out the right curtains. Huh?
For sure. And it's pretty different from how people often think of it today, especially here in the West. It's often boiled down to these really basic interior design tips, promising you better health or more money. You see these feng shui consultants and architects popping up everywhere.
Right, promising to feng shui your entire life.
Exactly. So when you see feng shui in like, I don't know, a home decor magazine or something, it's probably a really simplified version of a much bigger, older tradition. And I mean, historically, and even today in many parts of China and other places where it's practiced, Feng Shui was a really huge deal. It was used to determine how buildings were oriented, everything from houses to like tombs, which were super important spiritually.
So it's about fitting in with the cosmic order and the earthly order.
Exactly, finding that sweet spot. Now, before we really get into it all, I think it's worth mentioning that when we were researching this, it became pretty clear that from a scientific standpoint, Feng Shui is considered, well, not scientific. Some even call it pseudoscientific.
Yeah, I was going to say that's probably the elephant in the room, isn't it?
It is. Scientists and philosophers, they point out that a lot of the claims that Feng Shui makes about how the world works, they're just not testable in the way that science requires. You can't really prove or disprove it, and that's why it often gets labeled as pseudoscience.
Okay, so we've got to acknowledge that right off the bat. But, even if it's not scientifically provable, it's a practice that's been around for a long time. And that alone makes it pretty interesting to explore, right?
Totally. And it's a practice that has evolved over centuries, which is fascinating in itself.
So let's go way back. Like, where do we find the very first hints of Feng Shui?
Okay, so the oldest clues we have, they come from archaeology, way back in Neolithic China. We're talking Yangshao and Hongshan cultures here. And it's really cool. Even before they had compasses, these people were already using astronomy to try and understand how humans fit into the universe. It's really mind-blowing.
Wow, so they were already looking to the stars for guidance.
They were. Like around 4000 BC, there's this place, Banpo, where the doorways of all these dwellings were aligned with a particular group of stars called the Yingxi asterism. It happened right after the winter solstice.
The shortest day of the year.
Exactly. And they think they did this to get the most sunlight into the homes during the coldest time. So, even way back then, people were trying to make their homes work with the natural world, with the cosmos.
It's amazing how connected they were to the rhythms of nature.
It is. And then, later on, during the Zhao dynasty, they used that same asterism, they called it ding by then, to figure out when to build a new capital city. It's all in their texts from that time.
So they weren't just like throwing darts at a map to figure out where to build. They were consulting the stars.
They were. It shows how important those celestial cycles were to them. It's like they believed the stars held the key to everything. And we see this in other places too. Like there's this site called Dadiwan from around 3500 to 3000 BC. It had this big central building that faced south, kind of like a palace, and it was lined up perfectly with another building on a north-south axis. They think this shows they were already planning their communities based on these principles of orientation.
So they were already thinking about how energy flowed through spaces, even on a community level.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. And then there's this grave at Puyang, also from around that time, which is a really striking find. It had these mosaics that formed a star map, like a real map of the stars. It showed constellations like the Dragon and Tiger and the Big Dipper, all laid out on a north-south line. What's wild is that they also found round and square shapes in the tomb, and they think this is a really early sign that people understood the concept of Guding cosmography.
Gaussian cosmography, that sounds pretty complicated.
It's the idea that heaven is round and the earth is square.
Yeah.
We see these shapes in other sites from this period too, like Hongshan and Lutagang. It suggests that even way back then, people were thinking about these fundamental cosmic shapes and how they influenced life on Earth.
So these shapes weren't just random decorations, they were like deeply symbolic.
Yeah, they were tied to this whole worldview, this cosmology. It's mind-blowing how much they were able to figure out just by observing the sky. And it gets even more interesting. There's this jade piece they found at Heshan from around 3000 BC. It has these designs on it that archaeologists have linked to later Feng Shui instruments, things like the Lurin astrolabe, the south-pointing spoon, and the luopan, which is like the compass they use in Feng Shui. It really shows how far back these ideas go. Like, these weren't just random practices that popped up out of nowhere. They were deeply rooted in ancient beliefs and observations.
It's amazing how these ideas have resonated throughout history, huh?
It is. And it wasn't just for individual homes or tombs. Starting with the city of Iritu, every single capital city in China was designed using Feng Shui principles. We're talking millennia of history here. During the Zhou dynasty, they even had texts like the Kaogongji, which was like a manual of crafts, and it actually laid out the rules for using Feng Shui in construction. Later, there was the Luban Jing, which was a carpenter's manual, and it had Feng Shui rules in it too. So we're talking about some serious codified stuff here.
So from the smallest house to the grandest city, it was all about finding that right alignment with the cosmos. Now, you mentioned how they used astronomy before compasses. Like, what kind of tools and techniques did they actually use to figure out these orientations?
Well, like you said, they relied heavily on astronomy. I mean, some of the techniques we see today can be traced all the way back to Neolithic China. Of course, later dynasties like the Han, Tang, Song, and Ming added their own twists and refinements. But the core ideas, they remained pretty consistent. And the tools they used were pretty ingenious, considering they didn't have modern technology.
Yeah, like, what did they use? Was it all just eyeballing it?
Not exactly. They had some clever tricks up their sleeves. One of the earliest tools they might have used was a gnomon. It's basically just a stick that sticks straight up out of the ground. By looking at the shadow it casts, they could track the sun's movement across the sky, and that helped them figure out the cardinal directions.
Clever. So they were like the original sundial makers in a way.
In a way, yeah. But they didn't stop there. They also used circumpolar stars to figure out the north-south axis. These are stars that seem to rotate around the North Star, so they're always visible in the night sky. Actually, some scholars think that's why the Shang palaces at Xiaotun are oriented slightly east of true north. They were following those circumpolar stars.
So they were literally using the stars as their guide. But, using the stars, that seems like it could be kind of tricky. Were there any limitations? Like, what if it was cloudy or something?
Yeah, for sure. The weather could definitely mess things up. And, the precision of their tools back then wasn't exactly what we have today. So there was definitely some room for error. Later on, they started using a more precise method where they bisected the angles between sunrise and sunset to get a more accurate reading of north. This technique was used in some of the Shang walls at Yanqi and Zhangzhou.
So they were constantly refining their techniques, trying to get closer and closer to that perfect alignment.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just about the tools, it was also about the rituals. They believed that the act of aligning with the cosmos was a sacred thing. There were diviners involved who would carefully study the sky and make sure everything was done just right. They'd set up the instruments, their own position in relation to the stars. It was a whole spiritual practice.
It's like they were trying to bridge the gap between heaven and earth.
Exactly. And they weren't just trying to control the forces of nature. They were trying to harmonize with them. And, speaking of tools, the oldest actual instruments that we've found are these things called Lurin astrolabes. They also call them Shi. They're basically these boards, kind of like fancy boards with markings on them, and they were used for both divination and charting the movements of Taiyi, which is the pole star. The earliest ones we have are from tombs, somewhere between 278 and 209 BC.
So we're getting closer to the time of the compass now.
We are. And get this, the markings on these Lurin astrolabes, they're basically identical to the markings of the very first compasses. It's crazy. It's like a direct link between the ancient astronomical knowledge and the tools we associate with Feng Shui today. It's a perfect example of how these practices evolved over time, building on what came before. And of course, once the compass was invented, it became a total game changer for Feng Shui.
It revolutionized the practice.
You've got the Luopan, which is that compass with all the rings and formulas on it, and then there's the south-pointing spoon, the Yunnan. But, our sources say that even a regular compass could do the trick if you knew how to use it. And then later on came the Feng Shui ruler. It's like each dynasty added its own layer to this tradition, refining the tools and the techniques, but always keeping those core principles in mind. It's really a testament to the enduring power of these ideas.
So we're seeing this progression from relying solely on the stars to using more earthly tools like the compass. How did the practice of Feng Shui change in later Chinese history once these new tools became more widespread?
Well, after the Song dynasty, things started to shift. Divination, which had been a big part of the government, began to decline. It became more of a private thing. And that's when Feng Shui really took off. You had all these experts and diviners who started offering their services directly to the people. It became much more accessible, which made it even more popular.
It was like Feng Shui for the masses.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't just for the emperors and the elite anymore. And then, during the late Qing dynasty, Feng Shui experienced a huge surge in popularity. This was a tough time, There was a lot of poverty, and the government was getting more and more controlling. I think people were looking for some way to feel like they had some control over their lives, And Feng Shui offered them that.
It gave them a sense of agency.
Exactly. And it's interesting because even though the Qing government tried to crack down on what they saw as unorthodox beliefs, Feng Shui was so decentralized that it was really hard to control. It was happening in villages, in homes, everywhere. It was like this underground movement, in a way.
It's like the more they tried to suppress it, the more it thrived.
Kind of, yeah. And then during China's century of humiliation, when they were dealing with all that foreign influence, Feng Shui actually got a boost from the government, believe it or not.
Really? That's kind of surprising.
I know, right? But it makes sense when you think about it. You see, local leaders started using Feng Shui as a way to justify attacks on missionaries and colonial infrastructure. They'd say that these foreign things were messing with the local Feng Shui and bringing bad luck.
So it became a way to resist foreign influence.
Exactly. It was a way for people to hold on to their cultural identity and push back against these outside forces. And it's fascinating how Feng Shui managed to survive even after the Communist Party took over in 1949. I mean, they were all about stamping out these old traditions, and religion was really suppressed. But Feng Shui, it just kept going, especially in rural areas. It was like this folk practice that was so ingrained in people's lives it just couldn't be erased.
It had this deep grassroots resilience.
It did. And then, after the reform and opening up, when China started to become more capitalist, Feng Shui saw another resurgence. It kind of fit with the new emphasis on individual success and making money. It was like, hey, if I can arrange my house the right way and attract some good ki, maybe I can get rich too.
It was like the ultimate self-help tool for the new China.
Yeah, in a way. And that brings us to today, where Feng Shui is this fascinating mix of ancient tradition and modern adaptation. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the history, but let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are the basic beliefs and ideas that underpin all of this?
Yeah, what's the philosophy behind it all?
Okay, so at its heart, Feng Shui is all about managing qi, that cosmic energy we were talking about earlier. The idea is that you can control your luck and well-being by making sure the qi in your environment is flowing the right way. It's based on this belief that the things around you, your external environment, can directly affect your internal state.
So it's like your house can actually influence your mood or your health.
That's the idea. And the ultimate goal of Feng Shui is to achieve Shufu, which means harmony, like being in sync with the universe. They believe you can achieve this by finding that perfect spot, both in terms of location and timing, where the energy is just right. And, this was all really tied to ancestor worship back in the day, especially in farming communities. They believed that the spirits of their ancestors could influence their lives, for better or worse. So keeping those spirits happy was a big part of Feng Shui. It was about ensuring a good harvest, good health, all that good stuff.
So it's not just about rearranging furniture, it's about honoring those who came before you.
Absolutely. It's about finding a balance between the physical and the spiritual. Now, we have to address the pseudoscience thing again here. One of the biggest sticking points is the concept of qi itself. It's described as this vital life force. But it's not something that you can measure with a scientific instrument. It's more like an abstract concept, an energy field that's all around us. There's this ancient text called the Book of Burial, and it talks about how to use vital qi to find the best spots for graves and buildings. But proving that qi actually exists in a scientific sense is a whole other debate.
Right. It's like you can feel it, but you can't really see it or measure it.
That's the challenge. And then there's yin and yang, which is another core concept. It's the idea of duality, that everything in the universe is made up of these two opposing but complementary forces, like light and dark, hot and cold, masculine and feminine. Feng Shui applies this concept to everything from the landscape to the way you design your home. But again, there's no way to scientifically test whether these forces actually exist.
It's like a philosophical framework for understanding the world.
Exactly. And then you have the 5 elements, which are metal, earth, fire, water, and wood. These aren't just physical things. They represent fundamental forces in nature. Feng Shui aims to balance these elements in your environment to create harmony.
So it's about finding the right mix of these elements in your space.
Right. It's like creating a recipe for good qi. And speaking of recipes, we can't forget the bagua, those 8 trigrams that are so central to Feng Shui. They're like this map of energy, showing how different areas of your home or even your life are connected to different aspects of the universe.
So each trigram represents something different.
They do. And their origins are ancient, even older than the I Ching. You've got the Low River chart and the Yellow River chart, which are these super old diagrams linked to astronomical events from like the 6th millennium BC. There's even a connection to the turtle calendar from around 2300 BC.
Yeah, that's going way back.
It is. And you know what else is interesting? These diagrams are connected to how the ancient Chinese used to determine the cardinal directions. They used these constellations they call the 4 celestial animals: the azure dragon in the east, the vermilion bird in the south, the white tiger in the west, and the black tortoise in the north. These weren't just mythical creatures, you know. They were constellations they actually used to navigate by.
So it's like they were looking up at the sky and seeing these animal shapes in the stars. And they use that to orient themselves on Earth.
Exactly. It's like this incredible connection between the celestial and the terrestrial. And these animals were also tied to different seasons and elements. It's all interconnected, this web of beliefs and observations.
It's pretty mind-boggling when you think about it. So we have these ancient origins, these core concepts, but within traditional Feng Shui, are there different schools of thought, different ways of approaching it?
There are. The 2 main branches are the form school and the compass school. The form school is the older one. They focus a lot on the shapes and forms of the environment, both natural and man-made. They look at things like mountains, rivers, buildings, and they try to figure out how qi is flowing through these spaces.
So it's like Feng Shui landscaping.
In a way, yeah. They also pay attention to the 5 celestial animals: the dragon, phoenix, tiger, turtle, and sometimes the yellow snake. They factor in yin and yang, the 5 elements, and even things like the birth date of the residents and the date the building was constructed.
Wow, it's a lot to keep track of.
It is. And then there's the compass school, which is a little more recent. This school is all about the 8 directions and the specific type of energy associated with each one. They use the Lua pan, that compass with all the rings, to figure out how to align a building or a room with the best key. This is where techniques like flying star and 8 mansions come in.
So the compass school is more formulaic.
Yeah, you could say that. It's less about the big picture and more about the specifics of direction and alignment. And, you know, we've been talking about traditional Feng Shui, but what about the Feng Shui we see here in the West today? How does that fit in?
Yeah, is that even real Feng Shui?
Well, it's definitely been adapted to Western tastes. It tends to be a lot simpler and often focuses mainly on the bagua. There's this one method called the aspirations method that's pretty popular. They basically take the 8 areas of the bagua and link them to different life goals like wealth, career, relationships, health. Then they tell you how to arrange your home to boost those areas.
Okay, so it's like a self-help version of Feng Shui.
Pretty much. But it's important to remember that this method isn't really geomancy in the traditional sense. It doesn't involve analyzing landforms or using the compass. It's more about intention and symbolism. It's like Feng Shui delight.
So it might make you feel good,
Yeah,
but it's not necessarily backed by the centuries of tradition and knowledge that we've been talking about.
exactly. Now, going back to those traditional uses, it's interesting to note that Feng Shui wasn't just about personal well-being. It also played a significant role in environmental management. Especially in rural communities, Feng Shui principles were used to make sure they were living in harmony with the natural world. It was like a built-in sustainability guide.
That's pretty cool. So it wasn't just about attracting good luck. It was also about being responsible stewards of the land.
Totally. It encouraged people to think about how their actions would affect the environment and the community as a whole. And, because different regions have different landscapes and climates, different branches of Feng Shui developed to suit those local conditions. For example, in southern China, they had to deal with a lot of flooding and erosion, so their villages were often built on higher ground, and they had these ingenious irrigation and drainage systems. It was all about adapting to the environment and working with nature, not against it.
It's like an ancient form of ecological design.
It is. And you know what else is fascinating? Feng Shui also played a huge role in conflict resolution. It was like a social glue that helped keep communities together.
Really? How so?
Well, remember the concept of yin and yang. It's all about balance and harmony. In Chinese thought, there's this belief that everything is constantly changing and that opposites are actually interconnected. So instead of seeing conflict as a bad thing, they saw it as an opportunity to find a new balance, a new harmony. And Feng Shui experts were often brought in to help mediate disputes, whether it was between individuals, families, or even entire villages.
So they were like the original mediators.
Exactly. And because Feng Shui is based on this idea of cosmic principles, it gave people a way to resolve conflicts without anyone losing face. It was like, hey, it's not you, it's the key. It helped people to see things from a different perspective and to find solutions that worked for everyone. It also provided a framework for understanding why some people might have more good fortune than others without necessarily blaming or shaming anyone.
That's pretty clever. It's like instead of pointing fingers, they pointed to the cosmos.
Exactly. And you know what else? Our sources even mention Feng Shui being used for political protest. It might sound strange, but it makes sense when you think about it. By framing their grievances in terms of Feng Shui, people could express their dissatisfaction with the government or with powerful individuals without directly challenging them. They'd say things like, "This new building is disrupting the Feng Shui and bringing bad luck to our community." And because Feng Shui was so deeply ingrained in Chinese culture, it was a pretty effective way to get people to rally behind a cause.
It was like a coded language for resistance.
It was, and it actually worked. There are tons of historical examples of people using Feng Shui to fight back against injustice or to demand better treatment from the authorities. It was a way for them to have a voice, even when they felt powerless. And even the government recognized the power of Feng Shui as a tool for social mobilization. They saw it as a potential threat to their authority, and they tried to control it, but it was like trying to hold back the tide.
It's amazing how something that seems so esoteric can have such real-world implications. But, Feng Shui isn't all about harmony and social good. Our sources also talk about how it can be an egocentric practice in some ways.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because Feng Shui often focuses on individual fortune and success. It can lead to competition and even conflict between people. It's like, if your neighbor builds a bigger house in a more auspicious location, they might be stealing your good Kree. And that can lead to all sorts of problems. It can also be used to reinforce social hierarchies, with those who can afford to hire Feng Shui consultants having an advantage over those who can't.
So it's like it can be used for good or for ill, depending on the intentions of the people using it.
Exactly. And that's something to keep in mind when we think about Feng Shui today. It's not a magic bullet, and it can be used for all sorts of purposes, some of them not so great. It's up to each individual to decide how they want to use it and what role it plays in their lives. All right, so let's fast forward to the present day. Our sources mention that Feng Shui became pretty popular in the U.S. after Nixon went to China in 1972. What's the deal with that? What are some of the ways it's being used today, both here and around the world?
Yeah, it was like this whole China craze happened after Nixon's visit. Suddenly everyone was interested in Chinese culture, including Feng Shui. And even though there's no scientific evidence to back it up, it's still pretty popular today. You see it everywhere, from interior design to business consulting to personal development.
So people are still using it, even if they don't necessarily believe in the mystical stuff? Totally. For some people, it's more about aesthetics, about creating a harmonious and balanced space that feels good to be in. But for others, it's still very much about attracting good luck and prosperity. And it's interesting. Feng Shui has even started to make its way into fields like landscape architecture and urban planning. People are realizing that some of those ancient principles about working with the land and flowing energy can actually be pretty useful in modern contexts.
So it's like, even if we don't buy into the whole Kai thing, there's still some wisdom to be found in those old traditions.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm.
And there's definitely a growing interest in how Feng Shui can be used to create more sustainable, environmentally friendly spaces. There's a lot of talk these days about biophilic design, which is all about incorporating elements of nature into our built environments.
Mm.
And some people see Feng Shui as a kind of precursor to that, a way of connecting with nature that's been practiced for centuries.
So it's like Feng Shui is having a bit of a renaissance moment.
I think so. And it's interesting to see how it's being reinterpreted and adapted for the 21st century. But of course, there's still plenty of skepticism and criticism, both from scientists and from within the Feng Shui community itself.
Right, we can't forget about that. So let's talk about some of those criticisms. What are the main arguments against Feng Shui, both historically and in modern times?
Well, historically, a lot of the criticism came from Westerners who saw Feng Shui as just a bunch of superstitious nonsense. They thought it was all about dragons and magic and had no basis in reality. And then, during the Cultural Revolution in China, Feng Shui was seen as a symbol of the old feudalistic society and was heavily suppressed. It was considered dangerous and backward thinking.
So it's been through some tough times.
It has. And even today, there are still plenty of people who think it's a load of bunk. They point to the lack of scientific evidence and the fact that different Feng Shui practitioners often give conflicting advice. They say it's all just subjective and based on personal opinions, not on any real principles.
So it's like, who do you trust? Who's the real Feng Shui master?
That's the problem. There's no real regulation or standardization, so it's easy for anyone to call themselves a Feng Shui expert. And that can lead to a lot of misinformation and confusion. Some critics also point out that Feng Shui can be used to exploit people, especially those who are desperate for solutions to their problems. They say it preys on people's fears and insecurities, and that it's just a way for charlatans to make money.
So it's like any practice that deals with unseen forces, there's always the potential for abuse.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to be critical and to do your research before you hire a Feng Shui consultant or start making major changes to your home based on what you read online. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the history of Feng Shui, its basic principles, its traditional uses, its modern adaptations, and the criticisms it's faced. It's a complex and fascinating subject, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride. So where does that leave us? What are some of the key takeaways from all of this?
Well, I think the main thing to remember is that Feng Shui is a product of its time and place. It's a reflection of Chinese culture and cosmology, and it's been shaped by centuries of history and tradition. Whether or not you believe in the mystical aspects of it, it's a fascinating window into a different way of seeing the world and our place in it. And even though it's often dismissed as pseudoscience, there's no denying that it's had a profound impact on Chinese society and culture, and continues to be a source of inspiration and guidance for many people around the world.
So it's more than just a bunch of superstitions.
Way more. It's a way of life, a philosophy, a way of understanding the universe and our connection to it. And even if you don't buy into the whole Kwai thing, there's still something to be said for the idea of creating harmonious and balanced spaces that promote well-being and a sense of connection to nature. And who knows, maybe there's more to it than we realize. Maybe there are forces at work in the universe that we're only just beginning to understand.
Yeah, that's the beauty of it, isn't it? It keeps us guessing. And it reminds us that there's still so much we don't know about the world. So, to wrap things up, here's a question for you to ponder. Given everything we've learned about Feng Shui, its long history, its diverse applications, its enduring appeal, what does it tell us about our human desire to find order and meaning in the universe? What does it say about our need to feel connected to something bigger than ourselves? Is it just a bunch of wishful thinking, or is there something deeper going on here, something that speaks to our shared human experience, regardless of whether or not we can prove it scientifically?
That's the real question, isn't it? And it's one that each of us has to answer for ourselves.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Feng Shui. Until next time.